So, you were born in Wisconsin, and at 13, you were a soloist with the Houston Symphony. What was involved in that journey?
Well, my father was a university professor in music, and we moved around a lot when I was a young child because he was trying to get better jobs. And then finally, he got a pretty good job at the University of Houston. And so that's where I spent, elementary school and junior high school. And my father was a violinist, and my mother also was a violinist. And they were not particularly interested in anything other than classical music. And I wanted to be a classical pianist. And so I studied quite seriously, and my parents were very serious about my education since they were both professional teachers themselves. So, I took the audition for the young soloist for the Houston Symphony and won, and had the opportunity to play a number of times actually with the orchestra. I played the Mozart Little A Major. I played the Cacciaturian the following year, and later, after I went to Julliard, I came back and played the Rachmaninoff Second on the summer concert.
There's a recording of you when you were 15 playing Chopin at a recital.
Yeah, that was in Los Angeles. After junior high school for me, we moved to Los Angeles.
I was just wondering, when we see people who are young, who are such great players, we call it either talented or being gifted. And I was wondering what you thought of what mix of genetics or unique brain chemistry and plus, I'm sure, just really hard work.
My dad always expressed a definite opinion about this, which was that it was environment more than heredity. If you want to know the truth, I don't think I'm very physically talented for the piano. I always had to, I felt a lot of struggle just in coping with the instrument technically. And when I got to Julliard and I was sitting next to guys who could do in a heartbeat what it took me a year to accomplish, man, that really gave me a different perspective on it. But I was fortunate that my parents never somehow taught me to concentrate on my own game. In other words, don't be discouraged or distracted by what people around you can do. And though I was appropriately impressed by the abilities of my colleagues who are now playing concerts with orchestras all around the world, people like Garrick Olson and Emanuel Ax and who else was there? Misha Dichter, another guy who became a famous pianist. I still was concentrating on my own game. And let me tell you that classical piano is a hell of an education, man. It's one of the most intense disciplines in the world. And I think that my outlook on music in general, when later my activities expanded into a broader range of styles, and also when I became involved in composition, I think it was very influenced by that very basic taking music seriously. Because, in even jazz has had, half a leg into the entertainment business even now. So, I'm glad I had the education in classical I did, even though my hopes for being a classical player were ultimately disappointed.
So would you say there was a lot more hard work involved with your playing at such a young age?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know why I'm talking about my dad so much, but one part of his philosophy was what they used to call the liberal education, a broad view. So not only did I study piano, I studied cello, I studied painting. I was expected to do well in school. I graduated as a valedictorian in my class. And looking back on it, and by the way, I'm not much for second guessing the past. I believe in that old golfer's maxim, play it where it lays, which is however you got here, what you do is really from this point forward. But anyway, then to go ahead and second guess, I wish I'd focused a little bit more exclusively on music when I was, let's say, age 6 through 13. I became quite serious by the time I was 12 or 13, but those early years are so formative. And I think I might have been able to develop a little better physical relationship with the piano itself if I had had better technical training then. I also, unfortunately, had a very, what shall I say, technically repressed teacher at that age. He was a very well-known teacher. You know, I can't blame my parents. They sought the best teacher available in Houston, Texas, but the guy, he was just an old Germanic type, which introduced a lot of tension into my system, and I fight that tension to this very day.
At what point did you become drawn to experimental music in your own compositions?
The progression there is, though my father was a classical musician, he was not prejudiced against any other types of music. And when I discovered a Brubeck album when I was about 12, the album was Time Further Out. It's not the one that has Take 5 on it. It's the next one. And man, that album just blew me away. And I think one of the reasons I responded to it was because it was original compositions of Brubeck. I think that if I'd encountered, let's say, Oscar Peterson or something more straight ahead at that age, it wouldn't have made such an impression. So I fell in love with jazz, and I kind of tried to play at it, you know, but I've never studied jazz, which actually is a blessing in disguise. And then when I got to Julliard, I met a guy who was going to Julliard he was a jazz musician who wanted a classical background. In that time, there was no Julliard jazz department. And don't get me started on that pathetic experiment that the school made. But I started to compose jazz pieces, you know, and gradually my composing of jazz pieces through my first band, which was called Turning Point, became kind of transformed into what you would call classical music. They became longer, they used more different formal procedures, the harmony expanded, so that by the end of the Turning Point era, I was actually kind of writing classical music. And then I started really actually writing classical music.
Tell me about Antiphony from 1978.
Well, that's an interesting piece, and in some ways, I feel like that's the work that's most me, for better or for worse. And that piece came at a kind of traumatic time in my life when my marriage was breaking up, and it was also the last piece that I originally wrote for my fusion band. I mean, it's almost unbelievable to consider that a work of that complexity would be played by fusion musicians. But we actually did play it a number of times. But then I started thinking of I was getting more involved in recording then, and in that era, all the various things you could do in the studio were, you know, on everybody's minds. And there are two versions. One is a live version, which came later, and the 78 version was a studio version, which tracked instruments, turning 4 trumpet players into 36, and 1 harp into 3, and 1 cello into 14, and, you know, like that. That piece has a very odd kind of formal structure, which is, it's almost like intercutting between quite dissonant but minimal music influence. You know, minimal music is largely very consonant. And I was interested in this idea, but my harmony is so much more extended than, so much more chromatic than, Steve Reich or Terry Riley or Phil Glass, So the sort of minimal sections are quite, intense chromatically. And then there are these other sections which are, someone might make a criticism that those long saxophone solos, which are really the second and fourth section, belong in another piece. And I wouldn't argue with that, except it just felt right to me. And I never believe in trying to justify things logically. You have to get down to the intuitive level when you make creative decisions. And it just felt right to me to intercut those two other sections with the saxophone solos with harp, and in one case piano added. By the way, I've always been blessed with great soloists, and what Lou Marini played, at least Lou is on the studio version, and the live version at Cathedral St. John of the Divine is a wonderful Swedish player named Anders Paulsson. But anyway, that's kind of the story of that piece.
Well, the way you describe it, it sounds very much like you, with the saxophone mixed with the classical, and where you were going and all your influences and interests at the time, sounds to me.
Well, one thing that I believed at that point, which is late 70s, was that the future of jazz lay in extended forms. What Herbie Hancock was doing with the sextant and crossings. I don't know if you're familiar with those albums, that band he had before he funked out with Headhunters. And things that Weather Report was doing, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The jazz for decades have been organized according to choruses. You repeat, or theme and variations, you could say. But I thought the future lay in these more extended forms, and that is what I was exploring. Of course, what happened is the rubber band broke, or the wave, the wave crested and finished, and jazz then launched into 4 decades of retro copycat Elvis impersonators. Again, don't get me started on that one. The signing of Wynton Marsalis was like one of the worst things that could have happened to the music. And I was there at the time. I was a friend of George Butler, who signed Wynton. And when I first heard Wynton, it was just George's new hot guy. He wasn't the force in the business that he became. But all the toadying after supposedly in the name of respect of the older masters, by the way, a guy like Duke would never have hired anybody who played 50-year-old licks for himself. People who are creative, they respect creativity. They don't respect copycats and imitators. Anyway, there's a book of several volumes there, so let's not get into that.
So tell me, how did you get involved in Robert Altman's 1979 film A Perfect Couple?
Well, one thing I was doing in my 20s when I got out of Julliard, I'd gotten married, I needed to make a living, I realized I wasn't going to be a classical player, even though I'd given it my best effort. So I just started being what you would call a freelance musician around New York, and that gratified my interest in other types of music. And one of the things a pianist can do is you can coach singers, or you can write arrangements for them. And a lot of the singers I was involved with were involved in Broadway shows, and I would go to Broadway shows and, play their auditions, or I got a job, in the pit of a Broadway show. And gradually I worked my way up the ladder so that I was orchestrating and conducting the orchestras of Broadway shows. And I became close to the composer of Hair, a man named Galt McDermott, who was not a hippie, a far-out guy. He was actually a Canadian, very straight-ahead older man who was interested in being a country piano player, and he wrote these songs for Hair, and it became a phenomenon, as you well know, a world phenomenon. And I first worked for him on another wonderful show he wrote called Two Gentlemen of Verona, and I did several other shows with him. So then they were making a movie of Hair. And simply because I was close to Galt and he trusted me, he wanted me on that. So I was actually, the credit was originally supposed to be soundtrack produced by, but there was a little business disagreement there regarding points. And so I ended up walking, not walking off exactly because the contract was yet to be completed, but I had done like 70% of the job, and then suddenly the deal was not going to be what I thought I had a right to. And suddenly I get this call about Altman's Perfect Couple. And the way that seemed to have happened was, what you would call, I guess, a pincer movement. By chance, Altman had gotten my name from two different people he knew. One was a guy named Alan Nichols, a guy who had actually sung in Hair on Broadway, and he had sung some of my songs in demo tapes, and he had become an associate producer with Altman, and Altman needed a classical guy. So Alan said, I know this guy, Tom. And then at the same time, another friend of mine, Jeff Goldblum, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's an actor.
Oh, of course.
Jeff was actually a very talented pianist, and we became friends when he was just in the chorus of shows, and I was just an assistant conductor. And Jeff, through another route, had said to Altman, I know this classical guy, Tom Pierson, so, it was like rolling double sixes or something. I got the call, and since I had felt a little badly treated by the business people on Hair, I just moved to California, and I'd fall in love with a woman out there, so that kind of fit into the picture, and did a Perfect Couple, and right at that point, Altman's initial efforts for the Quintet movie, he had first approached John Williams, and Williams was becoming tremendously successful then, and he'd approached Leonard Bernstein, and neither of those worked out. So suddenly he needed a guy for Quintet, and I guess he felt I'd delivered the goods on a Perfect Couple. So, rolled double sixes again, and I got to write the music for Quintet.
So you appear in the opening scene conducting the orchestra in A Perfect Couple. And it never rains in Los Angeles, as a character says, but a rainstorm opens up while you're conducting. Well,
they're conducting an orchestra is a kind of ego trip, man, and I've known a lot of film composers who have fallen victim to that. Williams, for one, and do you know the composer Elmer Bernstein? He says,
of course.
and he out in L.A. was, eager to conduct this thing called the Young Musicians Foundation, which was all the great teenage players in Los Angeles. So conducting an orchestra is a trip, man, and film music gave me an opportunity to conduct the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the London Symphony Orchestra. Although I had trained as a conductor, I conducted Leonard Bernstein's Mass at the Metropolitan Opera, and I guess conducted the Houston Symphony also, which sort of sprung from my, piano efforts with them. So I was prepared for that. My film music, I had very good opportunities, particularly with the music to Quintet. That's my real music, that score. And as you probably know, the pressure to write imitative or genre music in film scoring is relentless, man. I mean, almost all the composers are forced to copying this or that. And I will say that in the Perfect Couple soundtrack, I directly imitated a 19th century romantic piano concerto. I even, studied the orchestration of the Brahms Second Concerto before I embarked on that project to kind of orient myself. But the quintet music is my real music. So by that point, I was sort of had found myself as a classical composer, and that's when I started my big band. And so my big band music was really influenced by those other colors.
So, talking about quintet, was there any discussion with Altman about what he was looking for?
Well, when I hear about meetings of movie staffs, I always remember that the three movie directors I worked for, Altman, who was the best boss I ever had, man, and Woody Allen and Milos Forman, man, especially Altman, he hired the people that he wanted, and then he gave them the room to do what he hired them to do. I mean, I hear terrible things from about other composing for film situations. I'll tell you, Woody was not that easy for me, partly because he'd put temp tracks against the film, and I was expected to imitate those, which I did my best to do, but he still wasn't, happy with what I did. And in the end, for the film itself, not for the soundtrack album, but for the film itself, he went back to a couple of his temp tracks. So I would never do it. It's a complete losing battle when a composer has to follow something that the director, who of course is the king, has decided that he likes certain music that was available on record. Well, then go ahead and use that. Don't bother me. Do you know the film Fargo, by the way?
Sure.
Are you familiar with the score to that?
Yes.
I'm so. This is just a guess. I don't have any information about that. But that score is so close to the second movement of the Beethoven Seventh Symphony that I think, man, that must have been the temp track. And then I forget that composer's name. I'm sure you know who he is.
Carter Burwell, I believe.
Right. And then the director says, well, this is what I like, or even takes it on him, Carter Burwell takes it on himself not to stray too far. There's nothing more cutting off your balls than being told to stay within boundaries, Although I happen to like that score to Fargo quite a lot, but it does seem sort of unnecessarily slavish to the Beethoven second movement of the Seventh Symphony. I don't know if you know that piece, but make a comparison in your own mind and say, could this have happened by chance? I say, no way it could have happened by chance. It's a deliberate copy. Anyway, see there, I wandered completely off topic.
That's great. No, because that is a common practice that I've heard over and over again in Hollywood, was the temp tracks. And I know some composers, if they're have enough clout, will walk out like, I can't even do this job because you've got a temp track and you have your own mind about what you want, and whatever I come up, you're never going to like. So
that's right. I mean, can you imagine hiring an actress and saying, what I really, and the director saying, or the producers are worse than the directors, but saying to the composer, saying to the actress, I really wish we had Betty Davis for this part. Can you play it like Betty Davis? What a dumb fucking thing to say. But that's what they do to composers.
Right.
Hire the composer you want and give him the creative room to do what he does. Although it's certainly true that a composer can screw a film. I've heard that happen a few times where I felt like, with a different score, this film could have made it. One is the thing called The Two Jakes, the Chinatown.
Sure, the sequel, yeah.
Yeah. That film to me was completely subverted by the score. And another one is the David Lynch Dune.
Oh, yeah.
Or June. I happen to like that film quite a lot, even though it's a famous flop. But the score is pathetic. And apparently they had hired, Toto and had a whole rock score for that, which they barely used. And then they run out at the last minute and get David Eno at probably a high price to write a 3-note melody, which the orchestrator turns into a score. And because he's under time pressure, he's writing a lot of slow music. A very relevant point is it's so easy to write slow music. You write a whole note and you're taking care of 5 seconds, right? Whereas if you're writing fast music, you got to work for 3 or 4 hours to get that 5 seconds. So, and then conversely, there are films that to me were completely elevated by the score. The first example that comes to mind is Star Wars. Man, without that glorious John Williams Wagner imitation, man, that would be a B picture. And with it gave it, it gave it expanse, it gave it grandeur, that score. So it works both ways. Yeah. So I can understand why producers and directors are gun-shy about composers. I think Woody was gun-shy about composers, which is why he was like micromanaging, and yet he wasn't even good at micromanaging, because he had me do rewrites where he could have simply told me that in the first place, and unfortunately I'd just come off of working with Bob Altman, who, like I said, was the greatest boss I ever had, and Woody didn't like me. I was too loud. I wasn't obedient enough for him. Altman encouraged people to speak their mind. Woody did not want it. Even, it's like, when people ask you a question, but they don't really want to hear the answer. Yeah. Well, I would give the answer. He and I just didn't get along.
When you were writing the music for Quintet, did you have a completed edited film to look at, or were you working on sketches and things during the production?
No. I remember later when I did Popeye, I was scoring while they were editing, so scenes were changing length. But as I recall, the edit to Quintet was pretty close to the final one. And Altman's, of course, any creative person loves space. It could be argued that Altman goes too far. I mean, we took a look at the film. He didn't even spot it precisely with me. I took the reels home with a moviola. That's the way things were done in those days. And I had the reels and the moviola, and I'm spotting the film myself and thinking, let's put music here, let's put music there. I took quite a long time to write that score, 12 weeks, because I always did all my own orchestrations. I've always considered it slightly unethical to use orchestrators, even though all the Hollywood guys do. Although I will say I saw Williams' sketches, and they were on 6 lines with pretty much every note written out. Maybe the orchestrator would decide what point in this woodwind sweep up am I going to change from clarinets to flutes, decisions like that. But man, when you hear a Williams score, you're really hearing 97%, what he wrote. But I've worked as an orchestrator for other composers, like, a guy named Arthur B. Rubinstein, or Howard Shore. I worked as orchestrators for both those guys. And, with Artie Rubinstein, man, he'd give me like a 2-line piano sketch, and I had to make it into orchestral music. So that kind of thing, the orchestrator is really composing. See, the time frame is really prohibitive, because the scoring is generally left up until the film is virtually completed. So, oh, gee, says the producer, oh, yeah, we got to get a composer. So, lots of times they don't even hire a guy until the film is completed. So now they want the film done as fast as possible. And I would say a typical period of time would be 5 weeks. There's no way a completely orchestrated big score can be done in that period of time, without an orchestrator. But I never used one, and I took 12 weeks to write the quintet music. Then the lawyers at, what was that, 20th Century Fox, that one? I get mixed up on companies. The lawyers figured they had me by the balls, so they decided to subvert negotiations. I'd made the same mistake. I was so eager to work that I didn't finish negotiating the contract. But in fact, it was I who had them by the balls, because they had engaged the London Symphony Orchestra. Man, they were committed to that. So, when they tried to switch contracts on me at the last minute, I said, look, guys, you expect me to get on a plane on Thursday? I need 10 grand in cash tomorrow, or I don't get on the plane. And guess what? I had that 10 grand in cash tomorrow. Man, the way lawyers and companies treat human beings is fucking awful. Man, it's just fucking unbelievable. And people should remember that when they get into all this capitalism versus socialism argument. You're giving guys like Trump fucking carte blanche to do whatever their limitations, permit them to do. So I won that little battle with the lawyers at whatever the movie company was. And then there's another little interesting business story on that one. I had not negotiated what they call credit and paid ads. Do you know what that is?
No.
Well, yeah, just so your name is there. And usually they put the composer's name in paid ads, but it's something that has to be negotiated. And I hadn't negotiated it. So now, this is, right after the score is finished and everything, I walk into Altman's office. And as I say, Altman treated people like human beings, man. You could talk to him. So I said, Bob, I think I should have credit and paid ads. So even Bob pulled that old, executive thing of starting to yell at you, But somehow I handled it right. I just took it, man. I just listened to him, and I said, Bob, I did the work. I deserve this. And it may have helped that I got... that they were happy with the score. So when I go into a rental store and pick up the box for Quintet, and I see on the cover that my name is there, it's because I was willing to fucking stand up to Altman and listen to his yelling and just keep saying, Bob, I did the work. I deserve this. And in the end, he gave it to me. He didn't have to because it wasn't in the contract. I mean, all that shit, man, all that shit is just not for me, man. I want to sit at home and write my music, man. I don't want to, try to get ahead, But in the movie business, you're competing with people who are highly motivated, man. There's some people who don't want to be anything else but a movie composer. Oh, by the way, here's a little factoid for you. Me and Jerry Goldsmith had the same piano teacher.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, one time when our teacher, a wonderful Polish pianist named Jacob Gimpel, was having a soiree at his house and I was playing, Jerry Goldsmith was there. And then, cut to like 40 years later, I'm playing piano in a hotel in Tokyo. And who comes in with his entourage but Jerry Goldsmith? And Jerry Goldsmith's, like, Japanese organizer came over because I was playing piano. And he says, "That's Jerry Goldsmith. That's Jerry Goldsmith." So I went over to the table on a break, and I said, "You and I had the same piano teacher." And he was fucking astonished, man. But I started telling all the personal details about, Mr. Gimple. This pianist was named Jacob Gimple, and he was convinced. But isn't that like an odd little, like, message in the bottle or coincident thing,
Yes, for sure. For sure. And, I was going to ask you, in Quintet, I hear some traces of early music, and I know the film has this wonderful futuristic yet medieval quality to it.
Man, you pinned that one exactly. That was exactly what I had in mind. I've always been interested in medieval music. One of my favorite composers is Guillaume de Machaut, and particularly using that thing called the Landini cadence or the double leading tone cadence. And I got it when I looked at the film. I got exactly the same kind of feeling that you just described. That there's something medieval about these costumes, about this behavior, about kind of the old-fashioned acting that was present in a lot of the characters. They're kind of almost operatic in a sense. So I don't want to say incorporated it, but that was an aspect of the harmonic approach. You got that one exactly, man. I'm thrilled.
Well, I just watched it again past about a week ago, and I've always loved the film, but it still holds up, and it's a real work of art in science fiction, which is rare in a lot of ways. Like you say, it can be imitation of genre films and so forth, but that's a pure original. What did you think of the final film? Were you proud of being part of that?
Well, of course. I mean, I was head over heels with the thrill of the big job. I wasn't making judgments on the film itself. In fact, I was surprised when Woody Allen's Manhattan became a hit. I just didn't anticipate it. And there was a lot of controversy about Quintet at the time. When I've looked at it in recent years, because I managed to acquire a DVD of it, wish I could get a DVD of A Perfect Couple, man. I haven't got one of that. But Quintet, I have a DVD, and I feel that it actually has improved with age. Anyway.
It's very unique. That's the thing. There's nothing like it in films as far as science fiction.
Well, science fiction is so much into that, like the advanced technology, but this is kind of the opposite. It's a science fiction with a reduced technology. The society is completely collapsed.
I was going to ask you about Milos Forman. So you were involved in the play on Broadway, you said? How did you get involved in the film?
No, I got to know the composer on Broadway.
Okay.
So then when his, musical Hair, which I had never done, was going to be filmed, and Gall McDermott, that composer, he brought me along with him.
I always thought Milos Forman was one of those filmmakers who could show America to Americans better than most of the people who were born here possibly could.
Well, I don't know if I would agree with you. I loved the original Hair. I saw it as a spectator on Broadway, and it was mind-blowing. And I can't say I'm a big fan of the film, because I feel like it became smaller. Mm-hmm. In fact, I always wonder what the film of Hair would have been directed by Altman. Big and sloppy, with really hippies. You know, the hippies are kind of antiseptic in the film here for me. Well, an interesting comparison would be Amadeus, where I also saw by the way, I actually did a little work on Amadeus, completely uncredited, but I saw the show on Broadway, and I don't feel the film was an improvement, but it was not so different. And there, Milos's sensibility suited the material much more, in my opinion. The Broadway Amadeus was much more focused on Salieri, whereas the film, the idea of Mozart as this sort of what would the word be, hyperactive child or whatever, that became more important. And it's a wonderful idea, that film, that play and film.
I noticed that in 2017, Varese Sarabande put out a expanded CD of the soundtrack to Popeye, which had a bunch of your music on it.
Yeah, didn't get paid for that one.
You didn't get paid.
In my old age, I'm simply not interested in business anymore. So the guy who prepared the liner notes for that calls me up, like we're talking, and they had the courtesy to send me a sample CD, but not to pay me. I needed to go get a lawyer and knock on their door, armed, as it were. But I simply don't want to use my brain for that anymore. I'm not ambitious. I'm more focused on the immediate gratification of my daily life and trying to create music. And besides, I don't give a fuck about Popeye. That was like, you want to know the story? There was a little complication there. Nilsson was fired. People don't know that. Huh. And Bob Altman got me in there to sort of pick up the pieces where Nilsson left off. So I was actually reorchestrating some of Nilsson's songs, and plus filling in all the traditional Popeye material, and so Altman really needed me this time, so got, full card credit and more money. And one interesting thing in my little short film career was that as the gigs got worse, the money went up. That was one thing that I realized, that in those, I think I did 5 films, I probably had as good creative experiences as I would have if I had been doing films for 30 years. So why stick with it, man? I graduated. Some people couldn't believe that I just walked away from that. But I never really wanted to be a film composer. I wanted to be a composer. Mm-hmm. And I'm not denying the importance of music in film, and I'm not denying the talent. Jerry Goldsmith, who you met, if I had to pick one personal favorite as a film composer, it would be him. But there, Bernard Herrmann, Williams, there are a lot of guys, man, who, I hope this doesn't sound too arrogant, could have been real composers. And I don't think any of them were really thoroughly happy with answering to directors and producers. I want to tell the story. I want my music to tell the story. I don't want my music to be a handmaiden to actors and writers and directors telling a story. So that's sort of my point of view. It was not hard for me to give up film music. And if later I'd been given another opportunity, I don't, unless I just really, really needed the money. But one other good thing that happened to me in my creative life was that I learned to live on less money. Success and getting money, it becomes like being a junkie. You have to move to a smaller apartment. How could you possibly do that? You've got a family. What about your kids' college education? Well, I got divorced, and I was on food stamps in New York later, and I learned to live poor. And now that I'm retired, man, living on like $1,500 a month pension, Social Security, and Musicians Union, believe me, being able to live on little money is an important skill. And that thing about the artist in the garret, there's a reason for that story.
When did you move to Japan?
Let's see, it must have been 91. When I went back to New York, which is when my life sort of became completely focused on my own music, I was living in a bad neighborhood. That's one of the great things about being poor, is you can't buy security. And I was a victim of crime 7 times, and finally I said to myself, I got to get out of here. And I had Japanese friends, and I knew there was a music scene in Tokyo, so I just came. And I was lucky, man. I started to work immediately. And, some other friends of mine were not so lucky but moving to Japan has just been a great thing for me. The impulse to move to Sweden came from concern about global warming. I picked a town way in the north of Sweden. But the corona numbers in Sweden are high, man. Apparently they fucked up on although I've heard the argument that next time around they will have herd immunity, that concept.
Exactly.
So we'll see if they do or not. But for now, the numbers are extremely low in Japan. So I'm wondering if I'm going to have to abandon this move entirely. Kind of at the moment, I'm hoping to go in a few months. But anyway, being in Japan it's been a great experience for me. And I've been able to work. I've been able to release my music. I hate to get into cliches about, different countries, but Japan it's not so much a sports culture, it's an arts culture. The United States is not an arts culture at all, really. So, I like it here.
Oh, you've had a lot of recordings since you moved to Japan, a lot of jazz.
Well, I hooked up with a teeny tiny CD company, and that was good for me. I made a mistake when I was in New York pursuing big companies. I felt like I was on the verge of a deal with George Butler at CBS, but now I found out that a whole lot of people felt they were on the verge with George. He was a girl who can't say no. So, George said for print that my big band was the most creative, exciting big band in the world. So when I quote that in my publicity, I put after it in parentheses, so why no record deal, George? But I think I wasted time looking for the big deal. I would have been better off looking for a middle-level company. I would have had a better chance. And, now it's just about getting your music out there. I made good money when I was a film composer, but by and large, I support myself in Japan by playing gigs, like, playing Girl from Ipanema in hotels, or I've always had teaching jobs, and that helps a lot. But I don't live in Beverly Hills like Williams and Jerry Goldsmith.
You directed a film, Turkey Boy, yourself, and created music for that, which was another direction, the blues.
Well, I originally wanted. I became interested in, or let's say interested again in film as a director, because that's really the, he and the writer are really the creative source for a film. And I made a little short film, and I got really involved in editing it myself, the short film. So then I thought, well, how can I take this to the next level? And suddenly I made contact with actors. I've always loved actors. I remain tremendously interested in actors, and I'm always on IMDb looking at who played the third taxi cab driver or whatever, and finding out that the guy won a Tony or something like that. That, in fact, evolving out of the classical music mindset, when I first got involved with Broadway, I just loved actors. I loved their attitude towards what they were doing. And classical musicians, they seem so stuffy and limited by comparison, And plus, there are all those gorgeous women. But now I've drifted off the point. What was I supposed to be answering your question?
Well, in the film, you provided music for it, which were blues.
Oh yeah,
music.
I originally wanted another guy to write the music, but he dropped out, and so I wrote the songs, and including the words, and I got very involved in writing the words, and I loved writing words. I'd written songs before, but somebody else had written the words. Sometimes, somebody sending me words for me to add music, and in one case, a song that was recorded on CBS Sony called Who's to Blame, where I wrote a melody and then a lyricist put words to my music. But when I do it myself, I write the words and the music together. And now I'm writing an opera, and I'm doing it the same way. As I write the music, I'm writing the libretto at the same time, which, when I teach students, I always say you should remember that the thing is being experienced from moment to moment, everything. So if you write 20 bars of a bass line and then add a melody, that's not really how the music is being experienced. So you should write it the way it's being experienced, which is more in the nature of an improvisation, even though it's slowed way down for, the craft of composing.
The woman who's the singer in the rock band who appears in that film was really terrific, and later she collaborates with you on a CD of your songs several years later.
Well, we both enjoyed it so much, and I really, she's, again, not to get into stereotypes, but let's get into stereotypes. She's not a typical Japanese female singer. Typical Japanese female singers are what they call idol stars, which is, girlish and sexual and Keiko Karachi can really sing. And I remember when she came into the audition for Turkey Boy, and I just taught her a couple of phrases from the bridge of one of my songs. And man, to hear those glorious high notes, I hadn't heard that in a Japanese woman before. And plus, she's so serious about, for collaborators, man, as I get older, I guess I'm getting more serious. And to experience seriousness and commitment in a collaborator is just so essential for me. And she was like that. So after Turkey Boy, I just wanted to write some more songs for her. And as I mentioned, I loved writing words. So the result was another album that uses pretty much everybody that had been involved in the movie. I was very satisfied with the way the movie soundtrack came out. But of course, the real trip was being a movie director. Man, that's the closest to king I'm ever going to be in this life. And I remember after we finished the film, and I went back to my, ordinary daily life of gigging at hotels, I was sitting like on the stairwell of some hotel waiting to go on and play Girl from Ipanema and Misty, thinking, man, 2 weeks ago I was like commandeering whole blocks of, a neighborhood to like shoot my chase scene in the film, and I had a staff of, 35 people there, and here I am, like, cowering in a corner, like, taking orders from a food and beverage manager,
Oh, man. Yeah, and people can watch the film on YouTube, which is where I found it.
Yeah, a friend of mine put that up. I'm very happy with having done that, man, and as I say, it was a great trip. I even wrote another film, which, again, to take it like to the next exponential level, but the next film would have required like about $20 million. But we got an actor attached to the film. I don't know if you know who Will Patton is.
Oh, sure.
Will Patton is not Tom Cruise, but he's not a nobody.
No.
And we tried to raise money for it, but just couldn't be done. And after 2 or 3 years, gave up. But I've got a whole science fiction script. Part of the reason it was expensive is because it's science fiction, and it's called The Conjugate. And in the future, your husband or wife, your partner, is called your conjugate, similar to conjugating a verb or a... Anyway, I had to put that all on paper. A lot of the Turkey Boy... I wrote, quote unquote, Turkey Boy as a storyboard because I wanted the actors to improvise their dialogue, even though the action was very, very specific. So it's not like having people vamp. It's more like somebody walks in and says, "How are you?" But they can say, "How are you?" or they can say, "How's it going?" or they can say, "Oh, what happened to you yesterday?" And we part of the audition for the casting was the improvisation. So we got people who could improvise. Plus, there was the technical problem where I don't speak Japanese, really. So I wrote this storyboard with rough indications in English, and the actors would take it from there. The credit in the film says story by Tom and dialogue by the actors, which is pretty much what it was. And I'd noticed in real films, watching the director's commentaries and everything, that actors often felt liberated when they could improvise. And there's a lot more improvisation in films than you might think. And there's one film, have you ever seen the one called Be Cool with John Travolta? But anyway, that director allowed the final take to always be an improvisation. So once he felt like he was covered, the next take he would say, "Okay, take it anywhere you want." And one of the actors on this voiceover was talking about just how liberating that was, and what a great. And of course, that's the way it is for musicians playing jazz. So why shouldn't it be the same for actors? So I liked using improvisation in Turkey Boy. But in The Conjugate, we were submitting the script to, companies and actors, agents and shit, and they want something down on paper. So I had to write a complete script, which I did.
I did note that in the credits. I saw that you credited the actors with dialogue, but yourself with the story. It was very interesting. It was really well done. It didn't feel sloppy or loose or anything. It had a really good story.
Well, I think the key is being very specific about the action. And as I say, I don't know if you've ever looked at storyboards. You can see Hitchcock's storyboards on. By the way, I'm a great believer in storyboards. Both Ridley Scott and Tony Scott use them, and I think when actors don't, Steven Soderbergh used them at the beginning of his career. He got so he didn't want them later. But I would always draw my storyboards, and then after the location was decided, I would redraw them for that location. I think that it's like free jazz compared to jazz on a harmonic pattern. Free jazz can have a tendency to wander off, and actor improvisation can have a tendency to wander off. But if you keep it pointed in the direction you want by the use of harmony, or in my case, by the use of very specific actions and goals to scenes, the person who walked in, say, well, by the end of this scene, you've got to be screaming at the guy that he stood you up yesterday, or something like that. A good improvising actor can run with that.
Mm-hmm. So around the same time as the CD of songs you released, you also had a double album of jazz with a really big sound called Last Works. Why that title?
Well, I had a big band for how long? Mid-'80s to now, 35 years. I had it in L.A. I started. I had it in New York, and I've had it for a long time here. And when I was, I've been embarked on writing an opera over the last number of years, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to complete this unless I wrapped everything else up. But I still had music. I'd made 2 big band CDs, but I still had a lot of music I wanted to document. So I'd thought about my Japanese band, but I remember how, suddenly I thought, this is a good band, but I want my New York guys. And so it became that. And we recorded it, I think, in 2015. And it was a very interesting technical process because had to go there. And my second album had been recorded analog and then mixed digitally. But this one had been recorded digitally. And when I heard Pro Tools mixes, I just didn't like them. I'm very suspicious of digital. It's always been a slightly inferior format for me compared to strictly analog sound. And I've taken many blindfold tests to prove it. But we ended up mixing it analog here. So that process took quite a long time. And then another phenomenon that's often neglected is the actual manufacture. I'd had good result from the Sony manufacturer, but company presidents, man, quicker, faster. If the customer doesn't complain, fuck them, So as a result, the quality of manufacture from Sony and also another one of the big 3 Japanese companies that I had direct experience has gone into the toilet, man. Their quality control people in the factories are just no good. You've heard those stories about Kubrick, the director, right? Where he would go to the theaters himself and, check the projection image, check the sound, and then the manager or owner of the theater would get a call from him saying, you're blah, 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 blah. I mean, that attention to detail. And after all, what the image is on the screen of the theater is what the customer is seeing. And the manufactured CD, the quality of that and the sound can change drastically depending on the pressing company you use. So I abandoned the idea of it being pressed in Japan, and I had a lawsuit with Sony because I refused to pay them for an inferior pressing. So in the case of Keiko, it was a French pressing company, and in the case of Last Works, it was a New York pressing company called Oasis. So I'm not going to make CDs anymore, man. I'm tired of these battles trying to, again, talking about the seriousness of your collaborators. You know, when it gets into companies and company presidents, you know, and you're one small client, you know, fuck you. Mm-hmm. By comparison, mm-hmm. my first LP, I am a little, I won't name names in this story, but my manager was a gangster. Now, this was in L.A. He was a gangster who had a somewhat important position in the music business. So my first LP is coming out. This is the era of LPs. So get the test pressing. And it's, you know, snap, crackle, and popping because the pressing machine wasn't clean, you know, right? So, going to complain about the pressing. Go over to this pressing company with a big, you know, gangster at my side. And, oh, this needs to be done again. There was no fucking argument, man. It was done again. And the second time, it was clean. So, you know, I don't want to be involved with gangsters anymore. I had scary experiences. But there is that thing, man, where I'm sitting there talking to the company guy, you know, the snide, you know, irritated company guy who doesn't want to be bothered with a customer complaint. But when I got Eddie standing next to me, man, the shit is done right. And I tell you, man, dealing with companies and collaborations, et cetera, when I'd have to say only about 10% of the so-called professionals are serious enough for me. Now, that may sound arrogant, too, but that's another reason I'm very happy to retire to me and my score paper. I'm not even concerned about getting my opera produced. I just want to get the document finished, and my job will be done. And if I want to spend a week deciding whether it's an 8th note or a 16th note, that's my business. I don't have to argue with somebody about why that's important.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Excited enough for you?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, that's one of the things about producers and company presidents, man, and capitalism in general. Guys who don't know are supervising the guys who do know. Yeah. Now, does that make any sense, man?
Yeah.
I mean, in any business. Oh, God, man.
Yeah. As I went along, a lot of the people I liked had backgrounds in jazz, and that wasn't planned at all. It was more like something in the orchestra and the tone, and there was some thoughtful tone or reflective quality I liked. I don't know what that is, but it seemed to be in the music of those guys, you know, and yourself.
Well, you know, it's interesting that classical music with Schoenberg, you know, decided to sort of like take harmony so far out. But in jazz, the complex harmony still, I hate to put it this way, sounds good. So I've always felt that my love of the jazz taste helped me create classical harmony that, if you pardon the expression, sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Well, I think that when guys get old, you know, the creative process is physical. There's a famous pianist over here named Yosuke Yamashita. He talks about squeezing your brain, and I think that's a great image. But I think when guys get old, let's say Goldsmith when he is 70 or 80, you just don't have the same physical capability. I think it's true of Woody Allen. I think his shit has gone really into the toilet in the last few decades because he's not capable physically. You know, they say that chess and physics are young man's games. You know, Einstein had all his breakthroughs when he was in his 20s because thinking is physical and creativity requires thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Well, like other things in life, when you get older, maybe this is just due to the diminution of energy, but your habits can just take over. And maintaining the childlike thrill of discovery, that would seem to me to be a necessary part of an aesthetic. And my ideal for artists would be Beethoven and Coltrane. They both progressed up until they died. It was changing. And yet there are fantastic artists who, when they got older, it just wasn't happening, like, let's say, Sibelius. Mm-hmm. But I think part of the thrill of being an artist is, it's like rolling the dice again, man. Maybe you'll hit double sixes 3 times in a row this time. Mm-hmm. You've always got a shot. Yeah. You can always start over. You can always reset. And that's a great thing.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the program.
Oh, my pleasure. And, use anything of mine you want, and blame the legalities on me.
You deserve better than that. I can't do that. You've been shafted enough so far, I think. But well, thanks again, Tom.
Oh, Tim, thanks a lot.